Oh, and it's really scary to walk into a room where you feel sort of out of place a lot of times. And that's most times in our heads, you know. We need to believe that we're worthy to be there.
There's the misconception that Africa always has to import technology, and perhaps we handle the assembly and everything, but never from the design to fabrication to deployment to operations to maintenance and actually building that successful project. For example, the clean cooking industry aims to avoid certain emissions, and clean cooking is super huge in Kenya, and with good reason, where even my grandmother still used to cook with fire up until, well, very few years ago, until now she had to buy a clean stove just to take care of her health and everything.
Certainly, creating a warm and engaging narrative for your podcast, consider Great Tell Me as a suggestion that combines an upbeat and inviting spirit without any background music. Welcome to Tangelic Talks, your go-to podcast from Tangelic, where we dive into the vibrant world of clean energy, development, sustainability, and climate change in Africa. We bring you inspiring stories, insightful discussions, and groundbreaking innovations from the continent making waves in the global community. Tune in and join the conversation toward a brighter, greener future. Let's get started.
Welcome to Tangelic Talks, a podcast at the intersection of energy, equity, and empowerment, with your co-hosts Victoria Cornelio and Andres Tamez. In today's episode, we have Diana Maranga, and we'll hand it over to her to tell you about her.
Hey, well, lovely to be here. Thank you for having me, first and foremost. Yes, so just to jump right in, I'm Diana Maranga, but just Diana is fine. I'm currently the head of commercialization at Octavia Carbon. Essentially what I do at Octavia and what that head of commercialization title means is that I handle a lot of the revenue bits of Octavia's operations. That essentially means partnerships, relationship building, contract negotiation, everything through the sales pipe. And it is essentially sales. And what I sell essentially is carbon credits. And a bit of background, but I'm sure we'll jump right into it a bit later. Octavia essentially is a direct air capture company based in Nairobi, Kenya, and essentially we build machines that filter CO2 from the atmosphere. I have a bit of an odd background, not too salesy at all, not business related at all. I have a background in IT. I actually majored in business intelligence and database management, so vastly different. But happy to share my journey of how I ended up at Octavia and head of commercialization as well.
That's super interesting. And yeah, it sounds like a pivot, but like within the same area, if that makes sense. It's not too crazy, but it is kind of like really random. So how did that happen? How did you get into this world?
Yeah, of course. I think it started a very long time ago. I think might have been around 7 or 8 years old. We do have, I'm not sure if you know who Professor Wangari Maathai is, but she is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. And well, unfortunately, she passed on a few years ago, but essentially I grew up watching her on TV, and she's the reason why there are a lot of green spaces still in the city's capital, Nairobi. And in essence, I was incredibly inspired by her because she was a woman and sometimes acting independently, just standing against the dictatorial government at the time, and was incredibly passionate, would not cower down to any intimidation, just actively passionate about protecting the green spaces in Nairobi. And that was sort of rang deeply to me, especially as a young woman, and just standing up for what you believe in, even if people are calling you crazy or odd. Away from that, obviously, didn't end up doing anything in sustainability in uni, even though I actually really wanted to do something to do in the social sciences. I was working at an international company as an IT engineer, but I soon got quite, bored a little bit. My best friend at the time, her sister, was actively working as Octavia's first electrical engineer, and she knew I was super passionate about this space. And she essentially just called me one, I think it was a Thursday evening, and was like, "Hi, Dan, I know, just come and see what we're doing here. If you like it, you can stay. If you don't, that's also okay. No hard feelings there." And yeah, that's how I joined Octavia, and I've been there ever since.
That's so interesting. It sounds like you went through a lot of stages to get there. That is super interesting. And you mentioned, being very inspired by a woman leading the way, so to speak. What does that mean to you, within the context in the work that you do?
I think it means a lot. It means everything. In the sense that perhaps, at least in my experience, and perhaps working in tech for a bit, most of it was very, how can I say, male oriented, and I wanted to be a bit of a pioneer in the sense. I had solid belief and very little experience in my leadership skills, and it means the world to me to be able to, one, be in sustainability and actively trying to reverse climate change and save the earth, and also being a woman in a leadership position in a climate tech industry. So I do hope it carries a bit of weight to the ladies and young girls, but I actively look to make an impact that way.
No, and it's really scary to walk into a room where you feel sort of out of place a lot of times. And that's most times in our heads, We need to believe that we're worthy to be there. That's super interesting. And what is the climate tech space that you're in then? What does that look like?
The climate tech space that I'm in, at least in Nairobi, Kenya, or just Kenya and Africa in general, very lonely. For context, we are Africa's first and the Global Talks first direct air capture company, so actively pioneering this tech is incredibly it's a steep learning curve, but also deeply rewarding in the work that we do. So I'd say it's quite lonely, but it's also very, very encouraging. And I wake up every single day loving coming to work, and it is hard work pioneering technology in a very where it's never been done before, and you kind of have to, even when I'm explaining to my family, they're like, "Oh, okay." When I first explained to my family, they're like, "Okay, what do you do again? What is that? Does that exist? Is that possible?" So it's having to I had to learn from the grassroots, so everyone else around me also had to learn from the grassroots, but so far so good. I think I'm loving it here. That's why I haven't left the space at all, and have no interest in leaving.
Fair. And what's that intersection of climate and tech? I think when people talk about climate and tech, they think about so many areas of it. Which ones are you specifically involved in?
So at Octavia, we typically pride ourselves in being fully vertically integrated. So in the essence that I'm a bit of a black sheep in a very massive engineering firm. For context, we have about 60 employees, around 45 of those are engineers. And brilliant engineers at that. So it's deeply inspiring working alongside pretty brilliant and smart people. And essentially what we do, and that engineering spans from manufacturing and fabrication. We do everything of that in-house, chemical production and that R&D work, towards operations and actively executing this project and deploying projects and logistics and procurement, everything, supply chain. It's deeply interesting and deeply educational for me, because I never thought I'd be able to work with such vast disciplines in my life ever. So it's deeply encouraging, and with everything that we do in-house, we get to pivot really quickly. It's a very, very fast-paced environment where I work, which is great because I was slightly bored in my previous role, as I mentioned. But yeah, it's deeply encouraging, and obviously always pivoting, which is also super.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier that you learn from grassroots. How does that come into the climate tech space?
Yeah, so DAC or direct air capture as a technology is incredibly novel. It's quite nascent. Not a lot has been explored around it. Perhaps a handful or so of DAC projects in the world to begin with, and obviously, as I mentioned, we're the first ones here. So it's a steep learning curve and actively trying to figure out things on your own. Obviously, there's learnings and there's literature and there's all that, but you only learn once you start doing it. And I always love saying, you shouldn't be afraid to fail. So you fail fast, you learn fast, and you pivot even faster. That's the only way you can get to sort of execute a project or a technology as nascent as this. And yeah, don't, I always say, or what we believe at Octavia is you don't have to wait to know everything to execute. You just don't have to be afraid to fail and learn everything through that process.
Okay, so kind of learning on the job.
Yes, very much so.
Very cool. And are there any challenges that you see kind of come up quite regularly, or are there any, I don't know, like barriers that you guys have seen when it comes to implementing?
Yeah, of course. I think first and foremost, what I always say as the very first point is just financial risk. In the sense that we're raising for director capture, which is very hardware focused, so very capex heavy, very capital intensive, but also a technology that at least in Africa no one has ever heard of. So we're always raising for DAC in Kenya when most people have never even heard of DAC. So you also have to start from the very educational level, and there's perhaps the belief that climate tech cannot emerge and be made by Africans in Africa and be actually work and be successful. There's the misconception that Africa always has to import technology, and perhaps you handle the assembly and everything, but never from the design to fabrication to deployment to operations to maintenance and actually building that successful project. Another thing I'd say is also, well, it's operating in a pretty pioneering environment is obviously policy and regulation is quite non-existent. And obviously, as you're also raising for capital, folks love predictability. I can't fault them on that. So obviously trying to navigate slightly murky waters and just getting the right regulation, but also informing the government and obviously the various ministries about what we're doing. And rightfully so, they were quite in the very beginning worried about the natural resources because our technology does operate with geothermal energy for a majority processes, but also there's land, you have water, you have all this, and it also obviously has to start from a very deeply educational level, and then sort of lead from there. So I'd say those are the very two top of mind challenges that we've faced so far. But we're actively trying to navigate those areas as we speak.
Of course. And you mentioned capital, which I think is always one of those things we struggle with in this sector. What's the venture capital landscape like for climate tech in the global south right now, and specifically in your context?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, well, in Kenya, firstly, the climate tech industry and green industrialization is absolutely growing rapidly. And not just for direct air capture, we have enhanced rock weathering, we have biochar and all that in the engineered carbon dioxide removal space. So I will say it's growing, and the environment and the ecosystem is very encouraging. But it's also still pretty difficult trying to raise capital for this, and especially capital across the funding across the capital stack. So I'm talking VC funding, which obviously means equity, and we are always, especially in such a capital intensive industry, to us specifically, we're always trying to be as non-dilutive as possible. So actively looking for grant funding or infrastructure and all that, and debt as well, which is and concessional debt is at a pretty favorable interest rates is really difficult. So what founders really need is just patient capital and just belief in the narrative that they're making, but also in traction as well. You can't just sell a story, you have to sell potential and traction as well. But yeah, I'd say that's how the sort of VC ecosystem landscape. We've been very rather successful, I'd say relatively successful in raising our seed round late last year, which is around $5 million both in carbon finance and equity, but actively now looking to raise Series A. And it's been, and for some context, our seed round was led by African VCs. because there's often, as much as the global North America, Canada, Europe, they do have a lot more dark companies, of course, and so they get to understand the technology. There's a bit of a geographical risk there that we've constantly had from potential investors that are a bit too far away. So this, yeah, which is it's fine, justifiable, I guess. But yeah, that's how it is, and Series A is looking quite likely to follow the same pattern, but you're actively looking to have conversations with other global VCs as well.
Wow, I love your passion. You sound very passionate, like when you're speaking. It's very contagious. I can see you really like it, and I can imagine with all the challenges and errors that you face. Like, what keeps you? Why are you so excited?
I think it's because just statistically, Africa is disproportionately affected by climate change, despite contributing the least emissions worldwide as a continent and not just as a country, as Kenya. And I've seen how devastating climate change can be, and just how vastly deteriorating it can also get. From the melting of the ice caps in Kenya, I think that's a very visual representation, but where I'm from ethnically, it's a very traditionally green area, very fertile soil and all that, to the point it gets humid. But in recent years, with irregularities in weather patterns, makes farming a bit difficult, and that's super harmful for an agricultural nation that just relies on agriculture for a lot of its exports. So it's harming smallholder farmers, largeholder farmers, exports, etc. And it's really painful to see your family not being able to get the returns that you usually do simply because of climate change. So I wake up every day super passionate to be able to work actively towards reversing the effect of climate change, obviously alongside other technologies, methodologies, etc. It always has to be all hands on deck. Dark and engineered carbon removal is not any better than the next one. It just has to work hand in hand towards achieving what we do, and we have a lot of work to do. I think they say we have 5 to 10 billion tons to remove annually from the atmosphere of excess CO2. That's insane. So a lot more resources need to be poured into various methodologies and towards reversing climate change. I think that's where my passion comes from. It comes from a bit of a slightly sad place, but it keeps me going. It is my main driver every day.
So you guys do the entire process, right? You're vertically integrated, so you have everything in house, and you do the entire process from R&D and production of the machineries that you want to use to basically help the environment, remove CO2 emissions. Is there an issue with scale? Like what is the demand for that right now? I know there's not that much education, and so you guys are working on getting, for example, politicians and all that to really understand how important this is. But is there already like a demand or like people wanting this in the country?
Yes. So as much as perhaps we have to start from the grassroots level and education and all that, we have seen pretty great interest and genuine support from the various ministries in the Kenyan government, Ministry of Environment, etc. They've been actively supportive and have various members of the government actively and publicly supporting us. So it is encouraging. Because they see, one, the potential of obviously the climate benefits of it, but also the sort of, how can I say, inward economic development that direct air capture and various technologies and green technologies can bring into the country, and not just job creation. We have revenue, just building the country's economy. And Kenya's President Ruto has been actively and has outrightly been a climate champion worldwide, really. So there is genuine support, and he wants carbon credits to be Kenya's greatest exports, past tea and coffee, which is a huge ticket to try and achieve. But so far so good. So we do have genuine support from the government and various politicians and all the those influential policymakers and all.
That's super cool. I think aim for the moon, land among the stars, right? That's what people say. And I think carbon credits tends to be one of those topics that people are a bit, like you said, not everyone knows what it means. And the people that may know have a certain misconception about them, let's say. So what are some of the myths that you have seen around carbon credits that you can help us debunk?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think I should just wear a mic in all my family events, especially because I sell carbon credits. So carbon credits is often seen as a license to emit, which I don't blame people for, especially if there's no deep understanding and mass education of what carbon credits can actually do. So yeah, it has been seen as a permission to emit more, that as long as some random people are selling carbon credits, then all the massive industries can just have a free for all towards emissions, which is obviously not true. But also in the sense that, especially in the Kenyan context, it's a bit more sensitive. There's a lot of public misconceptions surrounding carbon credits, especially surrounding the topic of green extractivism, where essentially project developers or certain project developers don't quite inform the communities into which they're developing their projects, don't inform them of the revenue and the potential that this certain projects can bring to them, and also obviously to the project developers as well. And to that end, thankfully, Kenya's Ministry of Environment and Climate Change put certain restrictions on that, where there should be sort of, I believe it's called revenue sharing or community benefit sharing, where a percentage of revenue from the project should and must go to the community. But that misconception of perhaps foreign companies coming to develop projects that folks don't quite understand, and taking all the sort of benefits or monetary benefits really outside the country, which obviously isn't right. And that's where the sort of local Kenyan misconception comes from. And yeah, I don't think it's the right thing to do. Obviously, community engagement must and should be done from the conception of any project that you're handling, dark forestry, whatever it is, and deeply explain to the community what benefits this project should have beyond obviously climate benefit, and then be very open about that. And I'm hoping that various regulations and that rigor will be implemented as soon as possible.
Yeah. And do you think that the misunderstanding of carbon credits is just a lack of information, or are there examples of them, being abused, so to speak? It's similar to sustainable development was meant to be this great thing, and now it's debated if it is.
Well, a carbon credit, like what exactly, like when you say you want to export carbon credits, that you want to be the main thing, what exactly does that mean? Like from the root, what is a carbon credit? Why does it matter? Right?
Yeah, a carbon credit is essentially, I like to describe it as a token or a certificate representing 1 ton of CO2 removed or avoided, or I think removed or avoided. Let's just settle with that definition. So essentially, for a project like ours, we actively remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And if we remove 1 ton and permanently store it, we store it geologically underground safely and for thousands, millions of years, then that is 1 carbon credit. Yeah. So now how we look at exporting, and surprisingly Africa has been trading, and Kenya specifically has been trading carbon credits since the early 90s. It's how some massive industries get to offset their emissions. Say they've emitted in a year, this is just top of mind, don't quote me on this, 50 tons. Now they should be required to offset said emissions and buy carbon credits from projects like ours or across the world, maybe 50 tons or more, right? So that's essentially the importance of a carbon credit. There are certain regulations, obviously, that should be put in place that mandates certain massive industries to have to offset, or just the cap and trade, where you're allowed to offset up to a certain point where it's not excessively harmful to the environment. And in case you do, and it is predicted that you'll do, you have to offset your emissions from certain projects. So that's the essence of a carbon credit and sort of exporting carbon credits as well.
So your service is basically could be for a company, they have a certain amount of sort of carbon debt, I guess you could say, and by using you guys, by supporting you guys, you can help them offset that, and for the amount of carbon they emit, you can help them remove a certain amount, and they can sort of reach an equilibrium.
Yes, that is,
or hopefully more than an equilibrium, right? We can remove carbon from the we can start removing it. Do carbon credits also work as in, like, let's say you have a baseline of amount of carbon emitted, if they manage to lower that by making processes more efficient, or does that actively count as a carbon credit for them? Okay.
I wouldn't say that. In essence, there should be activity in the sense that we always encourage people to reduce as much as possible, and then from there, please look to offset the said emissions that you can't quite avoid, right? So I wouldn't say reducing can qualify as a carbon credit, but perhaps in certain contexts, like for example, the clean cooking industry aims to avoid certain emissions, and clean cooking is super huge in Kenya, and with good reason, where even my grandmother still used to cook with firewood up until, well, very few years ago, until now she had to buy a clean stove just to take care of her health and everything. So that's emissions avoided, right? And you can get carbon credits from that, same as removing, but I wouldn't say avoidance would count, but don't quote me on that. I'm not an expert on the ever-evolving carbon.
But reduction, I imagine also it requires its own incentive structure, right? So that you can, so that people care about it.
Yeah. People care about it, and they can get to call themselves green.
They can put that in their promotional material.
Yeah, it sounds like it works for everybody when you do that. And then I wanted to circle back to something you were talking about of developing in-house, doing everything, basically at home. And there's been this trend of Africa specifically being a recipient of tech. So how do you guys ensure that Kenya isn't just a recipient of imported tech, but a leader in defining and developing it?
Yeah, so at least in Octavia, and we typically seek to repeat and reinforce that you have to build where the resources are, especially for direct air capture. And just for a bit of context, direct air capture is incredibly energy intensive because you can imagine, I think the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is around 0.04, they're about 0.04%. So you need to move massive amounts of air through a machine to actively capture a ton of CO2, as you mentioned. So in the sense that it's super energy intensive, so you cannot say that you're using sort of fossil fuel energy to now remove CO2 from the atmosphere. You're taking 2 steps back, which is very noble, but like 10 steps backwards. It doesn't quite balance. Now in Kenya specifically, we have our energy is thankfully over 90% renewable. So in that essence, we have very clean energy to actively remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And resources isn't just energy, it's both human resources as well. So we do everything in-house, but we also are very, very keen on utilizing the very talented and innovative Kenyan talent that we have in the country. As I mentioned, DAC is quite novel, it's quite difficult to achieve, so I don't believe that you need all the PhDs across the board to actively achieve DAC. It's still novel, so you still learn on the job. So in that sense, it's both human and natural resources that we are super keen on deploying direct air capture and just climate tech. So innovation does not need to be important. It can be locally grown, and it's often more resilient and also more cost effective. $1 here in Kenya goes a lot further than $1 in the US or in a pound in Europe. So that's how we also get to scale and propel as fast as we can.
You guys work with mostly engineers in your company, right? Which I think one of the big problems is a lot of companies have a lot of managers, right? They have a minority of engineers, and then you also have the fact that they don't. If you give engineers, brilliant people, enough time, they can solve anything. And
Yeah.
you don't really get that in a lot of sectors. They don't have enough time to do anything right.
And then I just want to close off with having you think about what would a truly inclusive, just climate tech future look like for you? What kind of future are you guys building?
We're building a future where, obviously, as I mentioned, we don't need to import any technology. Innovation can happen here, and very much against or very much for internal green industrialization and internal economic development, where essentially, in case, and a lot of companies have announced wanting to come to Kenya, obviously because of the resources, both human and natural, that I've mentioned, that to encourage them to use and utilize, obviously, the natural resources that we have. We need all hands on deck to solve this really, really huge problem, but also to keep in mind about the local talent that we have, and build upon that as well. So that's what I think climate justice looks like. You don't have to be victims of climate change, as I mentioned earlier. We're super disproportionately affected. You can do everything that you can with what you have to be able to move forward and just tilt the scale a little bit. We recognize that we are still a small company and we have a lot to do. But as I like to say, and that's why our project is called Project Hummingbird, you do everything that you can with what you have. A hummingbird is a tiny, tiny bird, and there's a lot of lore behind a sort of folktale. But time is up. I wouldn't dive too much into it, but just doing what you can with what you have. Either reduce as much as possible to take a bike, or build a project that actively removes CO2 from the atmosphere. It's either or. We all need, how can I say, personal responsibility towards solving this problem, but also the climate justice.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you so much, Diana, for being here, talking to us about tech, capital, and climate justice, which is this new innovation that some of us have heard, some people don't know enough about, and it was really cool to be able to break that down with you. We're going to keep breaking things down in our blog, so check out our blog at tangeliclife.org, and we'll catch you guys on the next one. Thank you.